Okay, so let's begin dissecting some sounds that we're going to find in a mix. And we're going to start with the all-important kick drum. Let's have a look at a kick drum that is in one of my sessions. All right, so first track on this particular session is the kick. And before I get into any of my processing, I want to demonstrate where it will end up on a VU meter after all the processing is said and done. So it peaks around -1 on a VU, which is just fine. Sometimes I'll have it peak at 0. Depending on how loud the 808 is, I may have it peak higher. It's typically louder than what I would have a kick in, let's say, an alternative rock record or a pop record. It's a little bit more boisterous and a lot more low-end heavy because that is what the audience is expecting out of this genre. It's part of the genre semiotics. So now let's take a look at the processing. With the kick in this, well, in any genre, I don't like to get too ahead of myself in terms of processing. I don't like to reinvent tone unless it absolutely requires it. But here's a little trick that I do on a lot of trap kicks. I'll put on Pro Q3 and I will create 2 dynamic bands. And by dynamic, I mean that it is triggered by the program material. So when a certain level of volume crosses a threshold, the band will either reduce or it will expand. I have them set to expand. So let's take a look at what this EQ is doing, and then I'll explain my processing ideas. And then without the EQ. So you notice that there's a volume increase that happens when the kick drum is articulating. The reason why I like to use a dynamic band in this particular case, rather than just a static increase in the volume of these frequencies, is because of the sustain of the kick. Now, remember, this is going back into the genre semiotics. The kick drum is the initial transient impact. The 808 we perceive as the sustaining bass. So any low end that is going to be sustaining off that initial transient is going to be then infringing upon the sustain that I know the audience is going to be paying attention to. So I don't want to mess with that. However, I do want a quick momentary boost just for the transient. That's what the dynamic bands do. So let's take a look at how I created that. You would just right-click the node, and then this says disable dynamics, but if it weren't disabled, it would say enable dynamics, and then we would select the amount of gain increase on the frequencies that we want when the volume breaches that threshold. Pro Q will then increase that low end momentarily and then bring it back down to where it was in order to preserve that sustain that's happening in the 808. You have to be mindful when 2 things are working together in a mix, what their jobs are. The other thing here is that I didn't use, but it's important that the kick has a voicing that is understood above this low-end sustaining 808. This usually happens around 1,500 cycles, 1,000 cycles, and it's that knock sound that is going to be coming out of the speakers. That is a very important frequency as well. I would say equally as important as the low-end stuff, because if you're listening to this record on a laptop, how do I know when the kick is there? I'm not going to know it by the low-end thump. I'm going to know it by that mid-range knock, because the laptop speakers or small speakers can't reproduce these low sub-frequencies. So it's important that that frequency is articulating. So I tested it out when I was mixing it. I felt like I didn't need it, but let's just boost it up just to hear what I'm talking about. That knock. Now, if you're listening to it on big headphones or bigger speakers, it will be a bit subtle, right? Because we're paying attention to that low end. But if you're listening to it on a laptop, that could be the difference of no kick and hearing the kick before that 808 sustain. These 2 frequencies here, just to talk about them very quickly, are the fundamentals. So the song is in the key of C, so if I boost that root note in my kick drum, I'm almost tuning that kick to the song so that when it does articulate, it doesn't clash with the root note of the 808. This area here is this sort of like area of bass somewhere around 100 cycles, 200 cycles that translates everywhere. Big speakers, small speakers, Bluetooth speakers, laptop speakers. You can hear it to varying degrees on each system, but you can hear it nonetheless. And I want to make sure that that's there and that that's knocking as well. So that's the EQ. And then what I'll typically do on every kick in a trap record is distort it just a bit. And for that, I use the Culture Vulture. So let's hear what it sounds like off, and then we'll hear what it sounds like on. And on. It's a little bit more growly, has a little bit more hair on it, a little bit more exciting. I typically do that to most of my trap kicks. I find it exciting. It's a taste thing. Other engineers I know will clip the kick drum and use a clipper. A great clipper is this plug-in here by Boz Digital. It's called Big Clipper. This is a very cool distortion and clipping plug-in. I didn't favor that sound for this particular production because it was a little bit of a low-key thing. It's always good to keep in mind the vibe of your record and make sure that your processing enforces that vibe. Another thing about kick drums in a trap record, a question that I get asked a lot is how do I make sure my kick drums feel big? And that gets back to gain structure and using your VU meter. So you saw that I put my kick drum at around -1 on the VU meter. That's where it's going to remain. If I balance to that, I know that no matter what I do, as long as I don't make anything louder than my kick drum, and by louder, I mean not just louder from a metering standpoint, but from a perception. If I'm, let's say, putting up a synth in this track, and all of a sudden my kick drum disappears, I know don't mess with that level. And I back off because I'm very mindful of what needs to be at the forefront. My VU meter confirmed that it's at the forefront, and I don't want to touch it. You can make any kick drum sound big as long as you don't put anything above it and set the level where you want it in the beginning and make sure it stays there for the rest of your mix. You're going to have a big kick drum until the end.